My name is David Miller. I have 56 years old, and I'm from Mesa, Arizona. For 20 years, I lived and breathed the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I gave everything, my time, my money, my dreams, my marriage. I believed that every sacrifice was an offering to God, and that blindly obeying leaders was the path to salvation. I truly believed this, until the day I realized that the faith I had dedicated to God had been exploited by men. For 2 decades, I followed orders, fulfilled callings, and closed my eyes to everything that made me uncomfortable, until the pain itself opened my eyes. Today, I decided to speak out, not out of anger, but because silence had cost me enough. Comment your city and country so I know where my story is going. Leave your like if you believe that faith must go hand in hand with truth, and subscribe for more real stories. I remember exactly the first day the missionaries knocked on my door. 2 smiling young men in impeccable suits and eyes full of light spoke with a conviction I had never seen before. At the time, my life seemed a tangle of doubts. I had recently lost my father and was searching for answers that traditional churches couldn't give me. When they told me that God still spoke to men, that there was a living prophet on earth, and that truth had been restored, something inside me ignited. For the first time, I felt that perhaps there was a greater purpose waiting for me. The first lessons were thrilling. Each meeting felt like a divine calling. I studied the Book of Mormon with enthusiasm, feeling that those words had been written for me. Ask God in faith if this book is true, they said, and I did. What I felt that night was so intense, a peace I had never felt before, that I interpreted it as a sign. I had no more doubts. The church was true, and I had just found my way home. I was baptized on a sunny Sunday. The water was cold, but my heart burned. The people in the ward hugged me, called me brother, and invited me to dinners and meetings. I had never experienced such a warm welcome. It was as if everyone had been waiting for me all their lives. The bishop told me I had a special spirit, that the Lord had great plans for me. I believed. And that was how I began to build a new identity, no longer the ordinary, insecure man I was, but someone chosen by God for a mission. For the first few months, everything seemed perfect. The Sunday services, the singing, the enthusiasm of the young people, the close-knit families, everything made me feel part of something pure. I sat in the pews with tears in my eyes, listening to the talks about faith and righteousness. Every word rang with absolute truth. I remember thinking that if heaven had a shape on earth, it would probably look like this: orderly, clean, and filled with people who smiled as they spoke of Christ. As I began to actively serve, my faith only grew. Becoming a priesthood holder was one of the most defining moments of my life. I felt worthy, useful, and guided. I believed that every small obedience, paying tithing, dressing modestly, avoiding certain music, following every direction from my leaders was a way of showing God my love. Obedience is the first principle of the gospel, they said, and I took that literally. It was around this time that I met my wife. She was also a convert, and as devout as I. We prayed together every morning, fasted, studied the scriptures, and dreamed of being an eternal family, sealed in the temple for all eternity. When we walked up the steps of the Salt Lake Temple for the first time, hand in hand, I was certain I was experiencing a miracle. Everything seemed perfect. The church became the center of our lives. Every decision was guided by it, from the friends we chose to the words we spoke at home. We lived for meetings, conferences, and callings. And the more time I spent there, the more I believed I was fulfilling a divine plan. I no longer saw the world outside the church as real. Secular life was just a test, and true happiness was there, within the white walls of the temple. But there was something curious. Though I couldn't quite put my finger on it at the time, the same love that led me to the church also began to blind me. I believed so strongly in the truth that there was no room for doubt. When someone questioned me, I said it was the enemy trying to confuse me. When I heard negative stories, I closed my ears. After all, the chosen must be tested. Thus, any discomfort I felt was treated as a lack of faith. Looking back today, I realized that fervor was the beginning of a long prison disguised as devotion. I didn't enter the church by mistake. I entered out of love. But love can sometimes blind us. It makes us lower our guard, surrender our hearts, and accept as sacred even what hurts. And so it was, with an open heart and closed eyes, that I began a journey that would change everything, not only my faith, but also the destiny of my family. The years following my conversion were an avalanche of spiritual commitments. Soon after my baptism, the bishop called me to serve in small positions in the ward, first as a young men's teacher, then as a counselor, and within a few years as a quorum leader. I felt honored. Each calling was presented as a divine choice, a direct revelation from God through His servants. And when someone said, "The Lord needs you," how could I say no? My life became a routine of meetings, responsibilities, and sacrifices. On Wednesdays, there were rehearsals and administrative meetings. On Sundays, 3 long hours of worship, testimonies, and talks. On Saturdays, missionary activities. And in between, there was always something else: visits to inactive members, interviews, conferences, temple work. I spent more time within the walls of the church than at home with my family. Over time, I no longer even noticed the fatigue. Exhaustion was seen as a sign of faith, as if working to the limit were a holy offering. Sleep little, study hard, serve always. There was a phrase we heard constantly: "The Lord's work never stops," and I believed it. The problem was that, little by little, my personal life began to grind to a halt. My wife lived alone in a marriage where I was constantly absent, even when she was present. Tithing was another test of faith. 10% of everything, and sometimes even more. At each tithing settlement meeting, I would sit before the bishop and proudly declare that I had been faithful. He would smile, put his hand on my shoulder, and say, "The Lord will bless you for this." And I believed. But in practice, the bills were late, the rent was heavy, and faith seemed to be the only currency I had left. My wife tried to hide her concern, but the sparkle in her eyes faded over time. I was so immersed in the routine of the church that I no longer saw the difference between faith and obedience. When a leader spoke, I listened as if it were God Himself. If the bishop asked me something, I didn't question it. If the stake president issued a warning, I took it as a commandment. And so I became a man who no longer made decisions, he just executed them. The priesthood meetings were long and repetitive, but there was something about them that nourished me. A sense of belonging. I was part of something great, sacred, eternal. Every time I put on my suit and badge, I felt pride. Proud to be seen as an example, as someone trustworthy. People greeted me respectfully, asked me for advice, called me faithful brother. It fed my ego, even if I didn't want to admit it. Over time, I realized that the system didn't just bind us by faith, but also by image. It was as if spiritual purity was measured by how active and visible you were within the church. If you missed a meeting, someone noticed. If you didn't smile enough, someone commented. Religion wasn't just faith, it was appearance. And the more perfect your appearance, the more worthy you seemed. I also began to realize how hierarchy controlled everything. Every word spoken by a leader was interpreted as divine revelation, even when it was merely a personal opinion. I saw brothers being praised for following the Spirit, when in reality they were just following orders. I saw others being publicly humiliated for small flaws, an inappropriate haircut, a theological doubt, a discreet criticism. And even when something bothered me, I remained silent. Because questioning was synonymous with a lack of faith. Obedience had become the greatest of commandments. Obey, even without understanding. Obey, even when it hurt. I believed this was the ultimate proof of love for God. And so, I continued to conform to the church's expectations, striving to be the ideal member, the exemplary husband, the tireless servant, the man who never said no. But slowly, something inside me began to crack. I realized that the approval of leaders brought me an almost addictive satisfaction. I worked not just for faith, but for recognition. Words of praise felt like blessings, and any criticism felt like a curse. It was at this point that I began to wonder, was I serving God or just trying to please men? I remember one particular night, after another long meeting, When I came home to find my wife sitting at the table, alone, with a cold dinner, she looked at me and said, in a calm voice, "David, you talk about love every Sunday, but you haven't looked me in the eye for weeks." I didn't know what to say. I stood there, caught between guilt and silence. It was the first time I felt something was wrong, not with her, but with me. At that moment, I realized the weight of my life of devotion. A devotion that had blinded me, that made me believe every sacrifice was holy, even when it hurt those I loved most. It was then that I understood, for the first time, that faith can become a prison when it is used to mold people instead of freeing them. I lived to please God, but I began to realize that I was actually living to please men. In the early years of my marriage, I believed I had found my true purpose in life. Our wedding was celebrated in the temple, one of the most sacred days I could imagine. I remember donning the white robes, smelling the sweet incense, and hearing the words that promised an eternal union. They said this was not just a marriage, but a divine sealing, something that transcended death and would guarantee our eternity together. I looked at my wife and believed with all my heart that nothing, not even time, could destroy that. In the beginning, we lived the perfect Mormon dream. The house was small, but filled with pictures of the temple, pictures of verses, and doctrine manuals stacked on the table. Every day before breakfast, we said family prayers. At night, we studied the scriptures. On Sunday, we dressed in our best clothes and walked to the chapel together. People looked at us with admiration, the faithful, exemplary, blessed couple. It was exactly what they expected of us, and we strived to live up to their expectations. But over time, the religious routine ceased to be an act of faith and became a requirement. Everything we did was measured by an unattainable standard of perfection. I demanded of myself and my wife a holiness that no human being can sustain for so long. Our prayers had to be always sincere, our home always impeccable, our behavior always dignified. If one day she showed signs of weariness, I would say, "The enemy attacks when we let our guard down." Without realizing it, I began to transform our home into a small temple and love into a constant proof of devotion. The temple, which once represented peace, became a symbol of accountability. We were taught that eternal families would only remain united if they obeyed every commandment, paid their tithes faithfully, and maintained absolute moral purity. Small slips in argument, a worldly thought, a doubt were treated as spiritual threats. I remember a conference where the speaker said, "Marriage is only eternal when the home is governed by the priesthood." At the time, it sounded beautiful. Today, I understand what it meant, that the husband's voice should prevail, even when it hurt. My wife began to change. She was a sweet, dedicated woman with a faith that inspired me. But as the years passed, I saw her shine fade. She strove to be the perfect wife, active in Relief Society, exemplary in activities, always smiling. But the smile no longer reached her eyes. One night, after a long meeting, I found her sitting on the couch, silent. When I asked what was wrong, she replied, "I feel like I'm surrounded by commandments, but increasingly distant from God." I didn't know what to say. All I learned was that the problem was always with the one weakening in faith, never with the structure that oppressed her. So I simply said, "Pray more. The Lord will strengthen you." Today I realize how cruel those words sounded. She didn't need prayer at that moment. She needed a husband who would listen. We were told the temple would unite families forever. But at home, faith began to tear us apart. Marriage became a race for approval. Every visit from the bishop, every worthiness interview, was an evaluation not only of our conduct, but of our soul. And the more I sought to appear worthy, the further I became from the person with whom I had promised to share eternity. The pressures didn't just come from within. In the Mormon community, everyone watches everyone else. Women are judged by how they dress, how they raise their children, how many callings they accept. Men are judged by how hard they work, how present they are in the priesthood, how often they speak in chapel. Life becomes a religious spectacle, a performance of purity that hides exhaustion. My wife and I were trapped in this role. We smiled on Sundays, but rarely had real conversations at home. The weight of perfection began to suffocate. With each piece of advice, with each new spiritual goal, something within us was lost. We were taught to resolve everything with prayer and fasting, but no amount of fasting could heal the void that had formed between us. Faith, once the strongest bond, became a wall, and yet we continued to serve, believing that sacrifice would save us. One day she asked me, "Do you think you still love me? Or just the idea of a faithful wife?" It hit me like a blade. I opened my mouth, but I couldn't answer, because, deep down, I didn't know anymore either. The marriage that began as a testimony of faith was becoming a testing ground. And in the midst of the quest for holiness, we forget that love doesn't need to be proven, just lived. I believed I was building an eternal family. But little by little, I realized that forever was just more time to pretend everything was okay. When we prayed together, I felt like there was an abyss between our hands. When we went to the temple, I saw a pain in her eyes I didn't understand. And yet, I kept telling myself that this was all just a trial. Mormon marriage is presented as the pinnacle of faith, the symbol of perfect obedience. But what no one says is that when religion becomes the absolute center of life, human love ends up taking a back seat. And when this happens, the temple ceases to be a place of peace. It becomes a reminder of all we sacrifice in the name of what we believe to be sacred. At the time, I still didn't understand. I saw her suffering as a lack of faith, when, in fact, it was the result of exhausted faith. I believed I was saving our family, but I was only repeating the cycle of control we'd been taught from the beginning. And so it was that the love that once united us slowly began to turn into silence. The rift didn't begin with an argument. It was born in silence. A silence that grew gradually, fueled by distance and obligations. I spent so many hours involved with the church that the house ceased to be a home and became merely a transit point between one commitment and the next. My nights were filled with leadership meetings, worthiness interviews, rehearsals, and missionary activities. When I arrived, my wife was already asleep. When she woke, I was already leaving. And deep down, I believed I was doing the right thing, serving God, ensuring blessings for our family. She never complained openly. On the contrary, she supported me with a weary smile, saying, "If it's for the Lord, it's worth it." But over time, I noticed something different in her gaze, a weariness that came not from the body, but from the soul. She seemed present, yet distant, as if she were always one step away from disappearing. I tried to compensate by bringing flowers, preparing dinner when I had time, but nothing filled the void that grew between us. The first argument happened on a Saturday night. I had promised we would spend the day together, but at the last minute, the bishop called me asking for help with a meeting. I was torn for a few seconds, but the decision was automatic. The Lord comes first. When I returned home late that night, I found dinner cold and her gaze icy. "Do you think God wants that kind of sacrifice?" she asked. "What's the point of talking about eternal families if even ours can't last until the end of the week?" I didn't answer. I went to my room and prayed, asking God for patience, not for her, but for me, as I endured what I perceived as a spiritual test. From that moment on, something inside me began to break. I continued to preach in meetings about love, forgiveness, and the value of family. But each time I spoke these words, I felt a weight on my chest. It was as if the Spirit were asking me, "Do you live what you teach?" And silently, I avoided the answer. Sundays, once days of joy, became tense routines. She would get ready in silence. I would put on my suit, and we would go to chapel together as if nothing were happening. There, we were the model couple. The sisters praised her, the leaders congratulated me. But as soon as the church door closed behind us, the emptiness returned. Our marriage had become a performance, and the stage was the pulpit. Over time, the faith that once united us began to divide us. I believed she was weakening spiritually. She believed I was losing my heart. I devoted myself more and more to church activities, as if I could heal what was broken with more prayer and service. She, on the other hand, became silent. Sometimes she would spend hours reading the Book of Mormon in silence, not out of devotion, but trying to understand where the peace she once felt had gone. One day, after a long quorum meeting, I came home to find her crying in her room. She was holding our temple wedding photo. "Do you remember that day?" she asked. "They said we would be one, but I feel like I lost you to the church." Her words hit me harder than any sermon. I tried to hug her, but she recoiled, not in anger, but in sadness. "You talk about God's love," she said, "but you've forgotten to love the one beside you." That night, I couldn't sleep. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, I thought about all I'd sacrificed: birthdays, dinners, simple laughter, in the name of an obedience that left me increasingly empty. I began to wonder if the God I served truly wanted this. If he wanted me to preach love while letting my own marriage slowly die. The following months were a cycle of failed attempts. I promised myself I would change, that I would spend more time at home. But all it took was the bishop asking for help or the stake president calling a meeting for me to abandon everything again. I told myself I was serving the Lord, but in reality, I was running away from the pain I couldn't face. It was easier to solve other people's spiritual problems than to address my own. My wife began avoiding church events. She said she was tired, sick, or simply needed a break. Some brothers commented, "She's pulling away. You need to be the example." I agreed, but deep down, something in me began to understand that her withdrawal wasn't rebellion, it was survival. She was trying to breathe free from the pressure of a faith that consumed us. One morning, after a heated argument, she said something I've never forgotten. "You don't have to prove to me that you love God. You have to show me that you still love me." The phrase echoed within me like an unanswered prayer. I realized that, in my religious zeal, I had traded human love for divine approval, or at least the approval of those who claimed to speak for him. I still believed everything could be restored, that fasting and prayer would heal what distance had destroyed. But the problem wasn't faith, but how we practiced it. We turned God into a judge and marriage into a testing ground. And when love needs to be constantly tested, it ceases to be love and becomes duty. At the time, I still couldn't admit it, but I already knew. The crack wasn't just in the marriage, it was within me. I was beginning to doubt whether I truly understood what it meant to serve God. Because, while I preached about God's love, I forgot to love the people around me. The collapse didn't happen overnight. It was a series of small silences, broken promises, nights spent sleeping facing each other, separated by an invisible abyss. Faith, once the pillar of our union, began to weigh down like a stone. I still believed it was all a trial sent by God, test of patience, humility, and obedience. But, deep down, I already felt something sacred had been lost within our home. The arguments became more frequent. At first, they were about simple things, the time I spent away, the endless meetings, the constant fatigue. But over time, the words began to hurt more than they healed. "You talk to God every day," she would say, "but you can't talk to me." I tried to justify myself, saying that everything I did was for the good of my family, that serving the church was serving God, and that God would bless those who were faithful. She would only respond, "Then why do these blessings never seem to reach me?" I remembered the bishop's advice: pray more, fast, trust the Spirit, and that's exactly what I did. I began fasting twice a week, praying more, asking for revelation. I cried out for God to restore the love that was shattering in our hands. But every time I opened my eyes after a long, desperate prayer, silence answered me. The Spirit, which I had previously felt in every word, now seemed distant, cold, as if it had left our home. My wife, on the other hand, began to completely withdraw. She no longer attended meetings, read scriptures, or prayed with me. Sometimes she would just sit staring into space, as if waiting for something that would never return. I tried to strike up a conversation, but she would just say, "I'm tired of fighting alone." And I wondered, how could she feel alone when I was there, doing everything the church taught? Only later did I realize that the problem was precisely that I was doing everything the church told me to do, but nothing of what love required. Guilt became my companion. I began to believe that the destruction of our marriage was a consequence of my lack of faith. I began attending the temple more fervently, seeking an answer, a revelation, a sign. I sat in the silent rooms, staring at the white walls, and waited to hear God's voice. But what I found was a void as big as my regret. I asked for forgiveness, but I didn't know exactly why. For having failed her? For failing God? For failing myself? Meanwhile, the distance between us became nearly irreversible. Conversations disappeared, prayers ceased. There was no laughter, no plans, no shared faith. All that remained was routine and a mechanical faith, repeated like a mantra to try to contain the pain. Each visit to church became heavier. The leaders would pull me aside and ask if I was standing strong. I said yes, even though I felt myself breaking apart inside. In one of these conversations, the stake president said something to me I've never forgotten. If your wife is pulling away, it's because Satan is trying to destroy you. Be the example, fast more, show obedience. I left that room believing I was fighting a spiritual battle. But looking back, I see that the real war was against myself, against the pride of believing that faith would solve everything, even when love was already dying. The nights grew long. We slept in silence, each on a different side of the bed, like two strangers sharing the same roof. Sometimes I would wake to find her crying softly. I would try to touch her hand, but she would pull away. And when I asked what was wrong, she would simply say, "Nothing. I just miss you." Missing what? I knew the answer: missing what we were before faith became a prison. I tried to recapture moments of tenderness. I took her to dinner, wrote notes, promised to change. But every attempt felt artificial, as if we were playing a role that no longer belonged to us. Even the prayers sounded hollow. I would start by saying, "Dear Heavenly Father," and stop halfway through, unsure of what to ask for. Because, at that point, I no longer wanted miracles, I just wanted peace. The downfall solidified on a Sunday afternoon. We had argued again, me for insisting we attend sacrament meeting, she for refusing to go. "I don't want to sit there pretending everything's okay anymore," he shouted, for the first time in months. The church said the Spirit would fix everything, but the Spirit doesn't live in our house anymore. I froze. Those words cut deeper than any accusation. I wanted to respond. I wanted to defend the faith. I wanted to remember the eternal promises. But all I could say was, "I know." That afternoon, I went to the chapel alone. I entered, sat in the last pew, and looked around. The place that had once brought me comfort now felt distant, cold, impersonal. The choir sang about eternal families, and all I could think about was mine falling apart outside. It was there that I realized a painful truth. Faith can build, but it can also destroy when it becomes an instrument of guilt and control. And my faith, so blind and obedient, had led me to miss what truly mattered. The following months were marked by absolute silence. She stopped attending church. I kept going, trying to keep up appearances, but I no longer felt the same. People still called me an exemplary brother, but deep down I knew I had failed not them, but her. It was in this emptiness that I began to understand that it wasn't the Spirit who had left us. It was we who had driven him out when we replaced love with obedience, dialogue with doctrine, and the heart with manuals. The church said that the Spirit would solve everything, but the Spirit no longer lived in our house. The abyss didn't arrive suddenly. It opened slowly, like a crack in the ground that expands until it swallows everything believed to be solid. At first, it was just a subtle nuisance, a prayer that seemed unheard, a scripture that rang hollow, a meeting that no longer brought peace. I continued to fulfill every commandment, every fast, every visit, but something inside me was emptying. It was as if my soul were present in body, but absent in spirit. Shame was the first to arrive. I looked in the mirror and saw a man who still appeared faithful, but who, deep down, already doubted. And doubting, within the church, is tantamount to betrayal. We grew up hearing that those who question are weak, those who think too much are tempted by the enemy, so I hid my questions even from myself. I tried to drown them out with hymns, with missionary work, with hours in the temple. But the more I tried to silence them, the louder they screamed. It was inside the temple that my faith began to die. There, where silence should bring revelation, All I felt was an empty echo. I remember one day in particular. I was in the celestial room, surrounded by light and people, dressed in white. Everyone seemed at peace, immersed in silent prayer. But I only felt a weight. The weight of someone repeating words that no longer have meaning. I looked at the paintings on the walls, Eden the Savior, the promise of eternity, and wondered, is God really here? Or did he leave long ago, tired of our repetitions? I tried to seek spiritual help. I talked to my bishop, to the stake president. I spoke about the emptiness, about the weariness of my soul. They listened to me, silently, and said what they always say. This is just a phase. You need to fast more, serve more, trust more. One of them even said to me, doubt is proof that the Spirit is testing you. I wanted to believe it. But how could the Spirit test someone with such silence? Each Sunday, the weight grew heavier. I sat in the chapel pews and watched the other brothers smiling, testifying, saying the Spirit was guiding them. I wondered if they were lying to themselves, as I was. I began to feel like an imposter, a man who preaches faith but no longer has faith, and this realization destroyed me inside. My wife had already left the church, but she still prayed in a freer, more human way, without following formulas. I stuck on the right words, envied her simplicity. I once asked, do you still feel that God hears you? She replied, I do, but not when I'm in church. I feel it when I cry alone. That struck me like a truth I didn't want to accept. Perhaps God really was out there, in the sincere tears, and not within the white walls where silence was imposed. Fear came soon after. The fear that I was drifting away, that I was being deceived by the enemy, that I was becoming an apostate. Because in Mormon culture, losing faith isn't just a personal matter, it's a scandal. An apostate is seen as someone who has betrayed the truth, who has rebelled against the prophet, who has become an enemy of God. I found myself in this limbo, trying to keep up appearances while my soul crumbled. Prayers became an empty ritual. I would kneel, close my eyes, and begin, Dear Heavenly Father, but soon my voice would fail. I repeated words by heart, not believing them. Heaven seemed like stone, deaf to my pleas, and I began to wonder, did God still hear me? Or was I just talking to the church? This question haunted me for weeks. Sometimes I would walk to the temple and stand outside, gazing at that perfect, clean, sacred structure. Everything there seemed unshakable, the marble, the windows, the gardens. And yet I, on the contrary, felt like a ruin. How could a building seem so eternal while the faith within me crumbled to dust? I tried to find refuge in the scriptures. I returned to the Book of Mormon, searching for answers, trying to feel that warmth in my chest that had once convinced me it was all true. But instead, I found pain. Every verse that had once inspired me now felt like a charge. If you keep the commandments, you will be blessed. But I kept them, and yet I felt cursed. With doubt, I began avoiding meetings, making excuses. I'm tired. I need to take care of something. I'm not feeling well. The truth is, I couldn't stand seeing forced smiles and memorized testimonies anymore. I couldn't stand hearing phrases like the prophet is never wrong, or the church is perfect, even if the people aren't. I knew, deep down, that wasn't true. I had seen the flaws, the injustices, the lies told in the name of obedience. Isolation was inevitable. The brothers began to look for me worried. We missed you at the chapel, they said. You need to come back before the enemy confuses you. But the enemy, I realized, wasn't outside. It was inside me, the enemy of guilt, of shame, of the constant need to be accepted by an institution that no longer represented the God I believed in. Spiritual solitude is unlike any other. It's not just being away from people, it's feeling that even God has fallen silent. And it was in this silence that I began to realize that perhaps He had never been where I sought Him, that perhaps God didn't dwell in the temple, nor in meetings, nor in dignified interviews. Perhaps He dwelled in sincere repentance, in the embrace that consoles, in the tear that purifies. But at that moment, I didn't know that yet. I only knew that all I had left was emptiness, an emptiness that echoed inside me like an unanswered prayer. It was inside the temple that my faith began to die, and ironically, it was also there that, without realizing it, I began to be reborn. The doubt that had previously haunted me began to transform into an impulse. After months of trying to silence the emptiness with prayer, I realized I needed to seek answers outside the circle that had always told me to stop asking. It was a mixed feeling of fear and liberation, fear of discovering something I didn't want to accept, but also an urgent need to understand why everything I believed in seemed to be crumbling. That's how I began to investigate. It all started discreetly. I would type questions into my computer late at night after everyone else was asleep. History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Errors of the Prophet. Questions about the Book of Mormon. At first, I felt like I was sinning just by typing. It was as if the simple act of searching was a direct challenge to God. But the more I read, the more I realized that what I had been taught about the only truth might just be a carefully crafted version of it. I found testimonies from former members, people who, like me, had dedicated decades to the church, served missions, paid tithes, believed in eternal salvation, and who suddenly discovered that much of the official history had been erased, rewritten, or covered up. Each account was a fresh wound, but also a glimmer of clarity. I wasn't alone. I wasn't crazy. I was just waking up. I began to read about Joseph Smith in a way I had never been allowed to before, not the idealized prophet of the manuals, but the flesh and blood man involved in polygamy, false sealings, and supposed revelations conveniently tailored to his whims. I discovered that many visions had been contradictory, that dates didn't match, that even the translation of the Book of Mormon had traces of plagiarism. It was like watching the curtain slowly tear away. At first, I tried to justify it. I told myself they were internet lies, fabrications of spiritual enemies. But the sources were official church documents, minutes, letters, diaries. The more I read, the more the pieces fell into place, revealing a structure built on secrecy and control. I realized that what we called revelation was, in fact, manipulation. A manipulation so subtle and well-intentioned that it seemed like faith. The discoveries became a silent addiction. I spent entire nights reading, watching lectures by historians, listening to podcasts by former members who had experienced the same dilemma. It was painful, but also addictive. Each new truth freed me a little, but also ripped away a piece of who I was. It was like taking apart your own heart to see how it works, and realizing it only beat because someone was holding it captive. One day, I stumbled upon a forum with hundreds of ex-Mormons sharing their stories. I read a sentence I've never forgotten. The church taught me to love God, but it also taught me to fear what He truly is. It struck me like a genuine revelation. I began to understand that perhaps faith didn't need to, and you just needed a change of owner. That God wasn't trapped in that system, nor did He speak only through prophets and presidents. That love, compassion, and truth were spiritual gifts, not religious monopolies. As I read, I began to remember everything I'd experienced. How the church said obedience was the path to salvation, but used that same principle to silence any opposing voice. How they called the simple act of questioning a sin, and how, for years, I'd confused submission with faith. It was like waking from a trance. I then decided to confront some leaders. I asked them direct questions about the documents I had found, about the historical contradictions, about the doctrines that changed over time. The answers were vague, evasive, or punitive. Brother, be careful what you read. These sources come from the enemy. Satan is cunning and uses doubt to destroy the chosen. At no point did anyone say to me, let's talk about this calmly. They didn't want dialogue. They wanted control. I returned home that night feeling a mixture of anger and relief. Anger at having been deceived for so long, and relief at finally seeing. It was like breathing after years underwater. I went to the bookshelf, picked up my copy of the Book of Mormon, and stared at it. That book that once made me cry with emotion now made me cry with disappointment. But even so, I didn't throw it away, because I understood that it wasn't the book that lied. It was the hands that interpreted it with human intentions. From then on, I began to rebuild my faith, a faith without labels, without fear, without hierarchies. I discovered that I could speak to God without intermediaries, that He didn't require my time, my money, or my guilt, only my truth. And the further I moved away from the institution, the closer I felt to Him. I began to see the world with new eyes. The people I had previously dismissed as lost now seemed free. The religions I had dismissed as false now inspired me with their sincerity. And for the first time in years, I began to pray again, not to a God of rules, but to a God of love. And this time, heaven was not silent. It was a painful process, yes. There were nights when I wondered if I had destroyed my soul, but I realized that you cannot destroy what has finally become true. Faith is not dead. It simply changed hands. Today, it belongs to me, not to the church, not to a prophet, not to a manual. It belongs to my conscience, to my heart, and to the silent voice that has always been there, waiting for me to hear it. Discovering the truth didn't distance me from God. It distanced me from the lie that used His name. And that was, paradoxically, the greatest revelation of my life. ChatGPT said, "The divorce didn't come like a bolt of lightning. It was a slow sunset, the kind that leaves the sky beautiful while everything inside grows dark." We signed the papers without shouting, without formal accusations. It was a farewell between two tired people who gave everything to what they believed in, and in the process, lost each other. I left the courthouse with a light briefcase in my hands and a new weight on my chest. The silence of the car in the parking lot seemed louder than any sermon I'd ever heard. I returned to a small apartment, smelling of fresh paint and absence. There were no pictures of the temple, no open scriptures on the table. There were boxes, a mattress on the floor, and a mug. A man in my early 50s, starting over like someone learning to walk. The first few weeks were a desert. The routine that once carried me, meetings, callings, spiritual goals, vanished overnight. Sunday became an empty street. I found myself tidying the house like someone preparing a sacrament, folding towels with futile care, lining up dishes as if someone would show up. No one did. And that's when I understood. Loneliness hurts, but it also teaches. It forces you to look at what's left when all the papers fall away. In my case, what was left was a tired heart, full of questions, and a fragile but stubborn will not to lose myself again. I started small. I established simple rituals, not to earn blessings, but to stay alive, taking an early walk in the park, making coffee slowly, listening to the sound of water, writing 3 pages by hand every morning, pouring out what hurt and what was growing. I bought a plant. I killed the first one, I confess. The second one is still going strong. I discovered the value of a table with 2 chairs. Even if one of them was empty, I learned to cook slowly. Above all, I learned to listen to my body, to sleep when sleep came, to cry when memory swelled, to laugh when, suddenly, life reminded me it still had grace. I sought therapy. At first, I arrived armed, my speech prepared, my pious justifications, the shame of having failed. My therapist didn't discuss theology. She asked about the boy I'd been. She spoke of limits, of learned guilt, of how duty can become addiction when it saves us from the fear of feeling. It was there that I began to understand that I'd spent 2 decades trying to earn love through performance, from God, from leaders, from the community, and that, without realizing it, I'd brought that same contract into my marriage. "You don't need to be chosen anymore," she said. "You need to choose yourself." I left with a tough task, relearning how to treat myself with kindness. I also sought out a support group of former members. They weren't angry apostates. They were ordinary people with eyes that knew how to listen. Each story felt like a window opening in a closed room. Someone spoke of sleeping without the fear of not being worthy the next day. Another about her first sincere laugh outside the chapel. One woman said, "I haven't lost my faith. I've lost the fear of calling her by name." Long hugs, respectful silences, tears that didn't ask for permission. It was there that I understood that community also exists outside the uniforms. It wasn't a new church. It was a place where no one needed to explain themselves to be welcomed. At work, I had to relearn how to be whole. I stopped accepting overtime out of guilt and started leaving on time for walks in the evening. I discovered a used bookstore and a second-hand bookstore that smelled of old paper. I started reading again for pleasure, not to meet study goals. I bought a simple guitar and learned 3 crooked chords. It was enough to unlock memories that routine had sealed. Little by little, I recovered old friendships that religious zeal had driven away. I apologized when I realized I'd been too harsh, too absent, too certain. I discovered that, outside, life also had liturgies, coffee with friends, laughter in kitchens, hands that hold without promising eternity. There were relapses. Some Sundays still hurt like a fresh wound. Sometimes a song on the radio would drag me back to a chapel pew, and I'd miss belonging like someone who's cold. Other times guilt would arrive, uninvited. What if I'm wrong? What if heaven demands this freedom? At those times I'd breathe slowly, place my hand on my chest and repeat, truth doesn't threaten love. Love doesn't threaten truth. Anxiety passed like a heavy cloud. Heaven remained intact. Regarding my former marriage, I learned to say the same name without war. We didn't become enemies. We became ex-partners who survived a fire. We spoke carefully, respecting the ruins and what remained of affection. If we once loved deeply, we also hurt deeply. And it takes patience so that the skin doesn't tear again. We made a silent agreement. Each of us follows our own path, but without rewriting the other person as a villain. When we meet, there's a nod, sometimes a smile. It's not a miracle, it's maturity, and that's enough. Spirituality, I discovered, didn't die with me. It just changed address. It now lives in simple places, in the sun streaming through the living room window, in the water falling warmly on my shoulders, in the forgiveness that has more to do with letting go than with absolving. I pray, yes, but less with words and more with attention. God, for me, has stopped being a performance manager and has become a presence. I no longer ask for proof. I ask for courage to tell the truth in gentleness so I don't harden myself inside. Sometimes I go back to any church, sit in the back, listen to the choir, give thanks, and leave. Other times, my cathedral is a park bench. Eyes closed, wind on my face. I started volunteering at a soup kitchen. On the first day, I washed vegetables, not quite sure where to put them. On the third, I chatted with people religion only remembered on service day. Elderly people who recounted their struggles, mothers who smiled with tired eyes, boys who asked me about my guitar. I learned the name of the doorman, the loud-talking neighbor, the bakery lady who always adds an extra loaf of bread when the day was tough. These are small belongings that don't require purity, they require presence. Over time, the apartment took shape. Landscape paintings, photographs of friends, books without highlighters, an inviting table, 2 cups that fit. I occasionally entertained loved ones. I cooked dishes that failed the first time and succeeded the second. I smiled inside when I realized I was doing the same, failing, trying, learning to temper myself. My plant grew, I repotted. I discovered that expanding roots need space and water in moderation. I wrote letters I never sent. To my former leaders, I thanked them for what was sincere and mentally returned what never belonged to me. The guilt, the vigilance, the fear of disappointing men. To the God I once feared, I confessed, I know almost nothing, but I want to love you without losing myself. He responded in the language of simple things. A leisurely morning, a healing conversation, a sleep that finally is restful. One day, I found a box filled with old mementos, my ceiling ring, photos from the temple courtyard, baptism invitations. I held it all for long minutes. I felt no anger, no aching longing. I felt gratitude for what I had been able to endure. I took one of the photos, the 2 of us, young, genuinely laughing, and put it in an envelope. I wrote on the back, "May this honor the love that existed, not the obedience that broke us." I kept it. It was a silent rite of passage. Today, when someone asks me if I've lost my faith, I answer, no, I've lost my fear. Faith now is less of a map and more of a path, less of a promise and more of a practice. When I make a mistake, I don't deny it. I ask for forgiveness. I rebuild myself. When I get it right, I don't blush. I give thanks, I share. I've learned that spirituality without freedom becomes a leash. Freedom without responsibility becomes an escape. I want both hands, the one that caresses and the one that supports. Sometimes I find myself smiling alone in the middle of the street. It's not euphoria, it's relief. It's realizing that I no longer owe anyone's gaze to exist, that I can enter and leave places without oaths, love without being bound by invisible contracts, believe without needing to be right. Life hasn't become easy, it's become mine. And that changes everything. If there is one sentence that sums up this stretch of the path, it is this. I had to lose everything to find myself. I lost the title, the pulpit, the audience, the narrative of the obedient hero. In exchange, I gained a heart that fits back into its own chest, friends who call me by name, a faith that doesn't ask for a receipt, and a future that doesn't demand perfection, just presence. Starting over isn't about returning to square one. It's about moving forward with what you've learned, lighter because you've left behind what wasn't love. Today, as the sun sets and the city slows down, I turn on a yellow light in the living room, make coffee, and play my 3 crooked chords. The song is simple, but it's true like almost everything that, in the end, sustains life. And I finally sustained myself. Time passed, and when I looked back, I realized there was no anger left, only scars that told a story. Anger is like a flame. It consumes everything it touches, including those who hold it. I had to let it die to see the light. Today, I don't hold a grudge. I learn lessons. I learned that forgiveness isn't a gift for those who made mistakes, but a respite for those who survived. And in my case, surviving was the first miracle. For years, I believed that faith meant obeying, even when my heart screamed. That serving God was the same as serving men in authority. But the desert I traversed showed me something else. God never asked for blind obedience. He asked for an awakened conscience. Because true faith is not submission. It is freedom. It is being able to look to the heavens without fear and say, "Now I know who I am, and what I believe comes from within, not from without." Today I understand that everything I experienced had a purpose. The tears I shed were silent baptisms, washing away the guilt that wasn't mine. Loneliness became prayer. Loss became rebirth. Every door that closed within the church led me down a path that didn't require temples to find the divine. I discovered that the sacred lies in simple gestures, in forgiveness sincerely requested, in a healing embrace, in a gaze that understands without judgment. I don't deny my past. It's part of what made me. The faith that once enslaved me also taught me to seek the true meaning of freedom. And freedom, I discovered, is being able to choose to believe without fear. Today I don't need prophets to speak to God. He listens to me when I walk in silence, when I write, when I take a deep breath, and give thanks for still being here. The truth hurts, but it frees. And it was this pain that healed me. I realized that blindly following isn't faith, it's giving up on thinking. Faith is having the courage to look into the abyss and even trembling, keep walking. It's doubting with an open heart. It's believing that God isn't offended by honest questions. He is saddened, however, by forced silence, by mouths shut in the name of obedience. I learned the difference between serving God and serving an institution. The church taught me to fear punishment. God taught me to trust in grace. Religion asked me for perfection. God asks me for truth. And in the end, it is truth that saves, not fear. The faith I have today doesn't need approval from any bishop, doesn't depend on worthiness interviews, nor does it require proof of donations. It fits within my heart and manifests itself in the way I treat others. I look back and see the journey as a crossing. On one side, the boy who believed in everything. On the other, the man who learned to discern. In between, the pain necessary to grow. Sometimes I think of all those still inside, trying to stifle doubt with hymns and meetings. I don't judge them. I've been there. I know that faith, when shaped by fear, feels like a comfortable prison. But one day, inevitably, the bars begin to bother me. And it's to these people I speak today. To those who feel something is wrong but are afraid to think about it. to those who carry guilt for not feeling what they're told they should, to those who were taught to obey before they understood. I want you to know, God is not angry with you. He is waiting for the moment when you finally have the courage to be free and still. Remain faithful. Faith is not a leash. It's a pair of wings. What I've learned is simple and powerful. The more you know the truth, the closer you get to God, not the other way around. Institutions may crumble, doctrines may change, but the divine essence remains intact within every human being. Because God never wanted temples of stone, He wanted hearts that shine with awareness. Today I live at peace with the past. I don't need to erase what I experienced to move forward. I carry everything with me, but now as a learning experience, not as a prison. That man who sought the prophet's approval has transformed into someone who seeks connection with himself and with the true Creator. And somehow I feel he smiles when he sees me free, because a free son honors the Father more than a blind servant. If there's one message I want to leave you with, it's this. Don't be afraid of the truth. Truth is God's language, and when you speak it, even His silence makes sense. May everyone who hears this story know faith doesn't have to be mindless obedience. It can be love, clarity, courage. It can be a new beginning. Comment, I'm awake. I want to know the truth. Leave your like if this story touched you. Subscribe to hear more real stories. And look next video. Another testimony from someone who also dared to tell the truth. Because in the end, true faith is not submission. It is freedom. And it is in this freedom that I finally found God.